How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another Pioneer tier list video. This week we're covering the last major week before Streets of New Capenna makes its way all the way out. It is released on Magic Online and Magic Arena right now, but it usually takes about a week for all the cards to make their way into the ecosystem and into the rental services. So while there are some cards that did make top 8s of the challenges, things like that, none of the prelim results from this week did have access to cards from Streets of New Capenna, so this is probably the last tier list before we actually see the effect of the new set on Pioneer. With that being said, let's deal with some housekeeping first. For those of you who enjoy these videos, be sure to like and subscribe. We're back down to only about 72% of you watching this who are not subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, be sure to leave a like and a subscribe. It really helps me out. Also, if you enjoy discussing Pioneer, be sure to check the link down below for access to my public Discord. It is a great resource for people who have been playing a lot of Pioneer and Explorer. We have quite a few people grinding the Explorer events, and we've been in there discussing some of the new tech. Finally, be sure to check out all my articles over on mtgarenazone.com, where I'll be writing articles weekly from May forward, so be sure to check out my metagame report that just went out yesterday, as well as my weekly articles. I think this week we talked a little bit about Esper Greasefang in Explorer Best of 1, and I'm sure we'll be talking about the Explorer metagame challenge as well. So for this week, we're starting, as always, with FNM tier. These are the decks that are going to be fine at your local FNM. They're a lot of fun, generally going to be reasonable decks, but in the context of a competitive metagame, they are not real contenders. They did end up on this list because they either finished 4-0, 3-1 in prelims during this week, or they top 16'd one of the two challenges from this weekend. But those are the exceptions, not the rule, as where I would expect them to land. First up, we have Rakdos Bloodhall. This is the evolution of the Rakdos Blood deck that Ekaros built that top 8s every once in a while, shows up in the top 16 periodically. It is unfortunately, I think, the weakest of the various Rakdos decks currently in the meta. Not quite up to snuff to compete with something like Red-Black Midrange. Next up, we have Mono Black Aggro. This is another deck that is a older staple that continues to come and go. I think it will gain a little bit from Streets of New Capenna as people potentially splash cards like Ob Nixilis the Adversary. But for now, still one of the weaker aggro decks, and March of Otherworldly Light really put this deck down. Next up, we have White-Black Control. This is a deck that is very interesting. I played a version of this week on stream. We played the Containment Priest version that's targeting more of the mid-range and aggressive decks. You still have the problem of running headfirst into the mono-green Karn deck, but I think this is an interesting adaptation that could see a rise in play in answering some of the aggro decks that have made their way back into the format. Next up, we have Red-Black Sacrifice. Kind of a surprise to see this down in FNM tier, but realistically, it's been on the downtrend. It has a terrible matchup into mono-green Karn because a lot of your grinding ability, power, and all of your permanents get shut down by Karn the Great Creator. We've seen Red-Black Sacrifice get as high as A tier in the past, and right now the meta is just very hostile towards it. I expect it will bounce back at some point. I'm sure that Ob Nixilis will be fitted into this deck, but as it is now, it is not really a great contender. Next up, we have Red-White Heroic. This version is not playing Feather. However, it is still similar to the old Red-White Heroic versions that were playing Luris before the ban. You're just not a very powerful aggro deck compared to even the mono-red deck that has been seeing more play recently. And synergy decks are in a tough spot when, if you aren't able to answer Winota 100% of the time, you are probably going to fall behind. And there are enough removal-based decks in the meta right now that I don't expect Heroic to see much of a resurgence. Last up in FNM tier, we have Blue-Green Ramp. This is a adaptation of the mono-green Karn deck, except it drops Karn for some elements of blue, Hydroid Krasis, Rapid Hybridization, so that you're able to better answer the Winota decks while still going over the top of all the low-to-the-ground aggro decks. I think of the three ramp-style green decks we're seeing, this is by far the worst. I think the other two are close enough in line that I would combine them, but this one is the one that stands out as, I think, an overreaction to trying to attack Winota and losing part of what makes you good against the rest of the format. Next up, we have the D tier. These are the decks that put up a result. They're more likely to put up results than the F and M tier deck, but in reality, these are decks I would stay away from if your goal is to put up a good result in this weekend's events. They can still put up reasonable showings, but I think they are either missing a piece, inconsistent, or unlikely to fight the top decks in any meaningful way. First up, we have Mono Black Devotion. This is a deck that has been popping up a little bit more recently. We've been seeing it leverage some of the high mana cost as far as Black Pip enchantments. It takes the role of a more controlling deck that then finishes you off with Underworld Dreams and Peer into the Abyss, as well as Grey Merchant of Asphodel. This is a deck that leverages the fact that black has some of the best removal in the format, but is a little clunky in its execution. Next up, we have Green White Angels. This is the deck that has gotten a new toy in Giada Font of Hope. While Streets of New Capenna isn't completely out, the deck that did top 8 this weekend was running for Giada. I think it is an interesting deck that will punish a lot of the low-ground aggro decks. It continues to be in the same place it often is when it comes and goes into the meta. A good punisher for aggro, very weak to control, and the mono-green Karn deck should be able to go over the top of it now that they have a full combo. Next up, we have Bant Control. This is another example of someone who got their hands on Streets of New Capenna a little bit early. They were able to play Endless Detour and a few other cards like Growth Spiral and the Triumph to be able to move from blue-white control into Bant. I think as it sits, probably not the direction I would take. I think Esper or blue-white are still where I would be looking, but it is an interesting adaptation, and I'll be curious to see if we see more Bant, Esper, or just staying to blue-white moving forward. Next up, we have Lotus Field. This is a deck that continues to drop mainly due to the presence of decks like Mono Blue Spirits, Mono Red picking up points, Winota, another tough matchup, picking up points, Mono Green Karn, another tough matchup. If you look at the most represented decks in the top 8s, Lotus Field is incredibly hated out against. While a very powerful deck in the vacuum, it is a meta deck that is able to prey on certain metas, but as the meta is very hostile right now, I would be putting away my Arboreal Grazers and Lotus Fields for the time being. Next up, we have Esper Greasefang, a deck that is very well loved by its community and puts up pretty consistent results of the Greasefang decks. It has been showing a little bit more promise lately. The addition of cards like Ledger Shredder definitely have my attention, and I think the deck could be in a better place moving forward. Having Mono Green Karn the Great Creator as a deck that is so prevalent in the meta is a problem, along with Mono Blue Spirits and Red Black Midrange all being able to adequately fight the game plan of Esper, and I think Greasefang as a whole being weak to the potential graveyard interactions from decks like Blue-White Control that can still come out of the woodworks makes it a volatile deck that can still spike, but is not a deck I would expect to do well on an average weekend. Next up, we have Grixis Lutri, a deck that has shown up a couple times the last couple weeks. Basically, any Grixis control deck has a reasonable shot against a deck like Mono Green Karn, being able to interact with Storm the Festival in the graveyard with Cling to Dust, counter big spells like Karn and Nissa, as well as remove all the elves. You are still a Grixis Lutri deck at the end of the day, and I think there is probably not a great reason to play this over some of the other builds you could make, but it is an interesting shell, and with the mana getting a little bit better and some more Grixis spells, maybe it does end up being a higher level contender in the future. Next up, we have the C tier. These are the decks that are on the cusp of being decks that I would consider playing for events, but they are still a little bit unfavored either against the top decks or in the overall meta. They tend to struggle. This is usually where decks that were previously in higher ranks tend to fall once they're having issues with the meta, and as such is our first deck with Izzet Phoenix. A deck that perpetually sat in S tier for the longest time is now finally starting to see some weaknesses in its place in the metagame. You have trouble with blue-red and blue-white control. You have some problems with mono-red depending on the builds. Mono Blue Spirits is close, though you are generally a little bit favored with your removal. But then you have Winota, which is close to a 50-50 matchup, and Mono Green Karn, which is a bad matchup. So when you look at all of the decks that are showing up often, Phoenix finally has a natural predator in Mono Green Karn that is a high percentage of the meta, and I don't see how Phoenix goes about correcting that matchup as it is right now. Next up, we have Niv-to-Light, another deck that is able to go over the top of some of these low-to-the-ground aggro decks that have risen up, but will still struggle with decks like Mono Green Karn. Red-Black midrange can be close. The control decks are tougher matchups, and they still are prevalent in the meta to a degree. And Winota will always be a close matchup, though it should be slightly favored depending on what type of exile-based sweepers Niv is running. I think Niv is in a reasonable spot right now, but I would not be taking it over many of the other decks above it. Next up, we have Bant Spirits. This is a deck that continues to show up when Mono Blue Spirits is on the rise because they both tend to try and punish similar decks. But the Coco version that is playing more threes and a little bit more of a linear aggressive strategy as opposed to the more tempo aggro counter style of Mono Blue Spirits, I think is the worst approach to the two Spirits decks. I think Bant Spirits is in a good position when people are playing slowly and then trying to play their 3s, 4s, and 5 drops, and then you're able to get under them, play your spell colors, use your collected companies, and get around them, especially when people are trying to block on the ground. The linear nature of the format right now means you are generally in a race, and the other decks have more removal than you do, so you're generally unfavored in those races. Next up, we have B tier. This is the lowest tier that I would say is a reasonable choice to take into these events. These are the decks that are reasonable choices that wouldn't shock me to put up a top 8, but if you told me they were going to win an event, I'd be somewhat surprised. They are both contenders that have previously been in the S tier, and they are both control decks this week. We start off with Blue-Red Control, which has fallen from its days of being a dominant force in the meta, mainly due to its matchup against Mono Green Karn. You're going to hear this a lot, and it is a major portion of why Pioneer is shaped the way it is right now, but if you have a bad Mono Green Karn matchup, you are going to fall down the meta right now. Mono Green Karn has been the top deck for 3 to 4 weeks now. A deck like Blue-Red Control can generally try and fight it through removing your elves. 2 Thing in the Ice is early, but it's still a situation where you don't have a lot of interaction for the Karns, you don't have a lot of ways to fight what they're doing, and if they get off the ground or you stumble, generally you can't really come back. Next up, we have Blue-White Control, which falls into a very similar boat. I think the Mono Green Karn deck is a reasonable matchup, but you're still struggling to answer everything. You have to counter basically every Planeswalker, every Storm the Festival, and you need to get down in early to Fairy to be able to protect what you're doing. You need to be hitting your farewells and being able to attack their graveyard, which isn't something that Blue-White generally does super well. I think the rise of Mono Blue Spirits and Mono Red also gives trouble to Blue-White Control because these decks are able to prey on the fact that even with the Wandering Emperor, you are still a little bit higher on the mana curve and can get tempoed out reasonably. Though you can beat those decks with reasonable top decks of Supreme Verdicts and things that interact like that, you are still generally unfavored against a lot of the higher tier decks. Next up, we have the A tier. These are the decks that are most likely to be top 8ing alongside the S tier. They are generally here because they are favored against most of the things below them, but they might struggle against the S tier decks above them. If you told me these decks were going to win the challenge, I would not be surprised. They are the essentially second tier of good choices. Generally, these are the meta decks that might attack your S tier decks, but we still have yet to find quite the right spot for them in the overall context of the meta. So first up, we have Red-Black Midrange, a deck that really likes to prey upon some of the other A-tier decks here. They like to play removal heavy, use your Planeswalkers to be able to leverage against the control decks. The addition of being able to focus your sideboard into things like Rending Volleys, to be able to attack Mono Blue Spirits and Winota gives you a lot of game. I think Red-Black is the best matchup into Winota, which is very important. It has game against Mono Green Karn, though you are unfavored if you're able to lead with your discard, get an early threat down. You can put them in a position where they have to top deck something, and if they draw an elf-heavy hand, oftentimes you can get them stranded on mana. However, you are still generally unfavored against some of the control decks in the meta, and I think the Karn decks can adapt in such a way that they are more able to survive your discard, especially with the addition of white mana, as we'll talk about later to the Karn decks. There are options that will make it a little bit tougher for Red-Black to actually take over the game. Next up, we have Mono Red, a deck that continues to oscillate a little bit, but mostly has been picking up points against the control decks, as well as having a very close matchup against Mono Green Karn. I have heard it split down the middle. The Mono Green Karn players I talk to say it's favorable for them. The Mono Red players say it's favorable for them. I think in reality it's a situation of how the hands line up, in such that if mono red has an early aggressive hand and mono green keeps an elf heavy hand, they'll fall behind, mono red will kill them. But in the hands that are things like Sylvan Caryatid, Wolf Willow Haven, into early Cavaliers or Old Growth Trolls, mono red will really struggle, especially game 1 when they don't have clean ways to answer 4 toughness creatures. Post board, both decks are jockeying in ways, with the green-white Karn deck adding in things like Portable Hole, and mono red adding in more Lava Coils, Rolling Vortexes, ways to apply pressure even once they're no longer able to attack. I think mono red is a very well positioned deck. It preys on mono blue spirits, and outside of the close matchup against Karn and a slightly poor matchup into Winota, you are mostly held down by the matchup into red-black midrange. And again, one of the reasons these A-tier decks are all in the A-tier is that though they might have some level of a good matchup against an S-tier deck, in the A-tier they all sort of rock, paper, scissors against each other. Next up, we have Mono Blue Spirits, a deck that has been rising and rising and rising alongside Mono Red. It won a challenge this last weekend. This time, Hero was able to close out the top 8 for the win, and I think Mono Blue Spirits is in a great position. It has a very good Mono Green Karn matchup. It has a close matchup against Winota, just because they're not able to actually remove your creatures very efficiently. Usually they only play 4 Brutal Cathars, some number of Skyclaves postboard. Voice of Resurgence is a problem for Mono Blue Spirits, especially as they try and counter the key spells, but because you have a bunch of flyers and Winota has no flyers, especially pre-board, you're able to sometimes steal games even after they've established a board on the ground. Your hardest matchups are the other 2 A-tier decks. Again, red-black midrange, mono-red, lots of ways to kill your creatures, lots of ways to kill them at a premium at low cost, so you're not able to really out-mana value them or protect your creatures efficiently. This is a deck that is able to prey on the S-tier decks to a degree, but is held down by its matchup against other decks trying to attack the S-tier decks. Finally, we reach the S-tier decks. These are the pinnacle of Pioneer in terms of qualifying finishes. These 2 decks outpace the rest of the field, though only slightly for one. These decks have continually risen above the rest of the meta. They are your most consistent top 8ers. They put up the most top 8s, the most finishes. They have the most raw power level, and honestly, it kind of feels like every deck is aiming for them, and they are still finishing at the top of the meta. It's a big reason why people have been talking about potential bans for these 2 decks. Given we have a new set, hopefully we'll see some shakeup, but they are definitely feeling a step ahead of the rest of the format right now. First up, we have Mono Green Karn. This deck continues to deliver. It came somewhat out of nowhere when Canister found the Pestilence Cauldron combo. Since then, it has been putting up top 8s, top 4s. It has been dominating challenges, dominating Magic Online. It has been everywhere. It had one of the best weekends we've seen in recent history for Pioneer last weekend. It still put up great results in a slow weekend of only 50 results. It put up 8 qualifying results. This is a deck that just continues to deliver. It's very hard to interact with, and now that we're seeing the green-white version, being able to splash for Portable Hole out of the board so you can get that with Karn, as well as some other choice options, we're seeing it continue to evolve and answer some of the tougher matchups that are coming along. If nothing changes in the metagame, I can't see the Mono Green Karn deck falling down. It is the deck I would be playing right now, and oftentimes in situations like this, there's a deck that is on the top and noticeably has stronger play patterns than other decks. It is something to watch out for, and you need to respect it, otherwise you will lose to it. Next up, we have the other S-tier deck, and that is Naya Winota, the deck that is able to consistently beat the Karn deck. It is one of the few decks that has a very consistent positive win rate in my mind against Karn. It is a long staple at the top of the meta, being able to quickly dump extra power and mana value worth of creatures into play. If you aren't interacting with the early creatures, if you can't kill a Winota on turn 3 or deal with a Chariot on turn 3, you tend to just fall behind in a way that the format can't handle. Winota and Karn are both decks that are able to snowball incredibly quickly, have a better than expected mid to late game, and are able to generally fight through almost any deck in the meta. There are some matchups like red-black midrange and blue-white control that you don't want to face. Izzet Phoenix is another one that was pretty bad before, but as Phoenix changes to more or less thing in the ices, it switches that matchup a little bit. I think Winota gets a lot of points by being good into Karn with the amount of Karn that's seeing play right now. but the deck is just generally very good into most of the meta. When we saw the resurgence of the control meta, Winota went down, but as control gets pushed out by these low to the ground aggro decks and Karn, Winota will again rise, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. With that being said, that is our tier list for this week. Be sure to check out next week when we see, hopefully, a shakeup with Streets of New Capenna. Let me know in the comments down below what cards from the new set you're excited for, whether it's Ob Nixilis, Luxior, or anything else. Maybe there's a Tenacious Underdog in there as well. Be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy the Pioneer content, and until next time, thanks for watching. Hey there. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you've enjoyed this content on either Twitch or YouTube. If you did, please like or subscribe. If you didn't, be sure to leave a comment down below. I promise not to read it. Until next time.